Hello and welcome back to another Demis Hellen tutorial. I hope everybody had a great new year, and here we are with the first video of 2021. So we've been a little bit quiet on the channel, but I have been planning some other videos, things that I couldn't get done last year, and I thought let's just focus on this after having a bit of a break and making sure that the content is nice and fresh for you. And what we're going to take a look at today is FM synthesis, and we're going to create a bass patch. We're going to create something maybe in the mid-range sort of bass, but we can create quite growling textures as well. And without going into great detail, frequency modulation synthesis, or FM synthesis, is a way to modulate a waveform. And pulling up a sine wave, if we hit middle C, we get a sine wave. We have a second sine wave here at -4 octaves, so that's 4 times lower than this one, and we get this tone instead. We can't really hear it. You can just about hear it on headphones, but it's in the range of being inaudible. If we hit the next C up on C4, we can start to feel a bit of low-end power there from the sine because it's starting to come into our audible range. And reducing that level and bringing this one back up so we can only hear the first sine wave, you can see that we are back to our normal middle C. But if we set this to FM from B, we're now going to modulate this using this slower waveform. And as we start to increase this, this starts to increase the amplitude, thus you can hear a more drastic effect. Now if we leave it there, you can hear now that the speed is going to double as soon as I move up 1 octave. And now that we have a little understanding into what FM synthesis does, without going into that too much detail, we can start to build presets based on this, and you'll be able to hear how we can create some harder sounds and create some more general sounds that you wouldn't be able to do just using static waveforms. Okay, let's shut this down, and I'm going to show you a bass that I've already created, and then we're going to create something very similar. We're not going to create an exact recopy of that. So feel free to pause the video at any point to follow step by step on how to create this sound. Now let's jump out of here, and we're going to listen to a bass sound that I've already created, and then we're going to create something very similar. I'm just going to show you the process. So we're not going to go for sound to sound and make it identical. We're just going to create something that sounds good. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like with a little bit of melody and a kick. Okay, let's jump into here. I'm going to copy that bass pattern over and drag it down to what we was demoing earlier using the sine wave, and we are going to initialize the preset here. Okay, so we've got a starting waveform of a saw wave. So I'm going to cycle through to the basic shapes, and we're going to choose a square. So we've got a square lead. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. So it's not sounding too great at the moment, it's just a square lead. Let's introduce oscillator B, and we're going to turn the level down to 0. And because this is going to be a bass preset, I'm actually going to turn the randomization down to 0, so we get the same starting point every time. So now, pressing a key, we still have the same sound, but quietly underneath, we do have a saw wave as well. So let's just use the saw wave as our FM source. We're going to jump into the square, and we're going to choose FM from B, just like we did in that quick demonstration, and we are going to modulate this and just see what it sounds like introducing this into it. So it does have an interesting sound, but it's not quite what I'm looking for. And one of the reasons is because the octave is actually too high. So I'm going to pitch this down 1 octave and see what the difference is. So you can see the range there when the amplitude is increased. It's a little bit too much, so we could get away with somewhere in the 50% region. and it's starting to sound more like a lead. And I'm going to try and sway away from that because we are designing a bass sound. So I'm going to bring this down an octave, and we're back to where we were, so I'm going to bring that down 1 octave as well. So I've just shifted both another octave down, so they're still the same distance away from each other. So we start to get a lot more control on that lower end. It's a lot finer tuned. And if we take that down another one, it gets a little bit too much. So we're going to drag that back up. -2 seems to do the trick, just 1 octave below the original sound that we're actually hearing. Okay, we're going to choose that position, and we're going to start using our usual things to do to create bass patches. So we're going to put on a filter. We'll leave it on an MG12 for now, and I'm just going to pick a position that sounds quite nice. Okay, that's a good place to start, and we're going to create the usual pluck sound here using envelope 2, and I'm going to drag that across to here, and then let's just drag this up as it's playing. So you can hear now that it's sounding a little bit hollow. You can hear those square elements that are coming through. It's still got that texture of a square, and it's sounding a little bit boxy if you ask me. So what can we do to start changing that up a little bit? So we have 2 options. One of the main ones that I'll use is the phase position, and the other one is a warping mode. So let's try the phase first. Let's have a listen to what happens when we move this. So because we've chosen 0 randomization, wherever we set the phase is where the sound is going to start. And you get punchier results in certain aspects. These are very basic shapes, but you will hear certain points are going to make the sound harder hitting and softer and quieter, all those different things. So let's have a listen to moving the phase on this saw wave. There's more bite on the sound with that part compared to moving it more to the right again. It becomes softer again and the attack isn't as hard. So I'm going to go for that position, but it's not adjusting the hollow aspect of the sound. So how can we get around that? We can actually drop the octave again, so they're matching. But because it's a square wave, we are starting to hear that hollow tone, that boxy tone is always going to be there. So you could go in and start using some EQ to try and remove it because it's there, it's present, and we can remove it at this stage. Let's try moving the phase here just so you can hear what's going to happen. So we get a nice sharp attack there. So let's leave that in. And we're going to actually use a bend mode. So let's use bend plus, and you'll see the shape of the waveform bend, but it will affect obviously how it's modulating the original sound. So we're getting that hollow tone at the moment, having this set at 0, but we've actually bend this. And what's happening here with the wave shapers, I'm going to call all of this list wave shaping tools, because that's essentially what they are. When we add the bend plus, you can see it's bending it and squashing it down to the point that these become quite sharp. And if you imagine that in terms of shaving a piece of metal down, you're going to get very sharp edges. And then again, if we do the bend minus, the opposite's going to happen to what we've just done. It's actually going to stretch that out. And what that's doing is giving you a rounder, softer sound. And if we change that back to bend plus. So I do advise looking at the visual cues, and you'll be able to hear and distinguish between the different sounds. The sharper the sound gets, obviously the more pointy the waveform's going to get. So let's put the kick underneath that. Let's just have a quick listen. If we turn bend plus Okay, now I'm going to shape the filter a little bit more. It's a little bit muffled at the moment, and I want something a little bit harder and present. So I'm just going to adjust the cutoff position there just to get a little bit more drive out of it, and then I'm going to increase the drive here. So here during sound design, I'm not really setting out to create a particular sound. I'll have something in mind, like a harder bass, maybe a 138 bass or something like that, a harder trance. And I will use certain techniques such as FM synthesis to get that result. So I'm not really trying to create a sound that's going to sound absolutely perfect and amazing in every track. I just need to create a sound that complements other ones around it. And what I'd do here later on, I'd get more to the point with the sound, I'd copy a melody over and just see what sort of melody it would work with. So let's have a listen to this again. I'm going to go into the effects, let's go into distortion tube, I'm just going to crank the drive up. And I'm just going to add a little bit of drive texture, a bit of tube texture to that sound. You can hear it softens it down quite a lot. If we just bypass that again, just listen to the attack and how hard it is without the distortion on. It gives it a softer texture. That's all fine. We can sort that out in a second. So I'm going to go into post and set this to high pass, and I'm just going to bring this down so there's no like Q value on there. I'm just going to roll out some of that lower end where it gets a little bit gritty and muddy, and we'll keep it around that kind of 50 Hertz area, as you can see down here. And what we can do is, I've shown you this in a previous tutorial, I'm going to use an LFO for this, is to drag this over, create a little bit of a curve down like that, and we're going to set this to envelope mode, and we're going to turn off BPM, so we have full control over the speed of how fast that hits. Let's attach this now into this, and every time a note hits, we want this to start from 0 and work its way up to 100% mix. And this will give you the full raw sound unprocessed by the distortion, and then distortion will be applied after, once this curve starts ramping down. No distortion, full distortion, and we can control the speed of that obviously. So let's have a listen to that. Not really much happening. Is no distortion because you can see it's not even getting anywhere, it's that slow. Let's bypass this modulation. So we go back to being quite soft. And that gives you the best of both worlds. It's now cutting off that distortion for that first part of the hit of the note. Every time that note is hit, that is going to kick in, and then it'll bring in that saturation, that distortion, whatever you're choosing. And you can do this with reverb, delay, anything that you want the sound to still come through raw. It's just basically sidechaining the actual effect or the parameter, whatever you're choosing to do. And then finally, let's just put a bit of compression on here. I don't usually do this, but it's another way to demonstrate adding a little bit more attack to that bass sound to give it a little bit of a harder appearance. The harder we push that threshold, the clickier that sound gets, and the more intense this starts to become. So you can hear now with the attack being slow, letting that attack come through, and obviously the compression once it's hitting harder is actually accentuating that. The release is really quick, so it's actually shortening the sound down for us without having to go into the amp mod. You have to be aware of things like that. It's not actually physically reducing the length, it's squashing that length down, and it's becoming less and less audible, and it starts to sound over compressed. So really it does depend on the sort of sound that you're going for. that way. It just gives you a little bit more control over your bass, and it stops it flapping around all over the place in your mix. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope this gives you a little bit more of an insight into FM synthesis and how it's not really this kind of big, scary, complex thing that you have to learn and get to grips with. There's a lot more involved in terms of how it works, but the fundamental is this is your waveform, this is your secondary, and we're telling this one to modulate the first one, giving us a frequency modulated sound. If you enjoyed the video, please let me know down in the comments. Also hit the like button and the subscribe with the bell icon so you get notified as soon as a video is uploaded. And I will see you all in the next video.